What's up, guys? Welcome to the podcast. My name is Salman Ali at Salman Ali NBA on X. Here, joined by Ben DuBose at Ben DuBose. He covers the Rockets for USA Today Sports Media Group. How you doing, Ben?
Doing well, ready to get draft and free agency week started, my man.
Yeah, as you can see, I'm a little rusty on the intros, but it's good to have you back on the show. It's been a long time since we talked. Real quick, for the audience listening or watching, be sure to subscribe to the Random Truth Podcast on YouTube, iTunes, wherever you listen to the podcast. Give us 5 stars if you're listening on iTunes or Spotify. And yeah, guys, that really helps the show out. All right, so the NBA draft is a few short days away. We're going to be previewing the Rockets end of things. Obviously, they have the number 3 overall pick via the Brooklyn Nets. And I think, barring some unforeseen trade, this is probably going to be the only real exciting event of the Rockets offseason. I've talked about this before on the show. This is shaping up to be kind of a laid-back summer for the Rockets. They're probably going to pick up all their player options, sign someone on the MLE, and then call it a day. Draft night's probably the only night where we might get some fireworks. Let's start here. Before we get into the players that could be available at number 3, all the reporting that we got this week seems to suggest that Houston will entertain offers for the pick up until the buzzer. As it stands now, Ben, do you think Houston trades or keeps the pick?
I think keeping is always the safe bet, simply because so many things have to align in order for there to be a trade. I will say I think the odds of a trade would go up significantly if Donovan Clingan is on the board, because it seems like to me, from the scenarios that I've read and what I've heard, I doubt the Rockets trade out entirely. I think the odds are they might look at moving back into somewhere in the 6 through 9 range, and I think a lot of those teams could be moving up, like Memphis, like Portland, for Donovan Clingan, a very
San
high
Antonio.
floor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Conceivably Clingan could pair with Wemby and be that sort of enforcer, if you will. So I think Clingan being on the board and the top 2 picks being the French guys, Reed Sheppard and Sarr in some order, that would open up the most possibilities. But I mean, I think for starters, you'd most likely need Clingan to be on the board, and then you'd need the other team to be willing to offer enough for the Rockets to say a deal is worthwhile. We know it's not a great draft class, so I think the odds, there's a reason why there haven't been that many trades at the top of the draft in general over the last decade, and so I think you combine that with all the uncertainty of this year, and I think the odds-on scenario is it's just staying pat.
Yeah, I've been pretty consistent in saying that I think Houston just keeps the pick. I'm with you. It's very hard for teams to trade a top 5 pick, like
Right.
emotionally, right? I don't care how weak people think the class is. Like, it's only been done like a handful of times this century. The Rockets may be in a unique circumstance in that they aren't supposed to be here, right? But I still suspect there's like a 65% chance that they keep the pick. 35% is high in terms of like projecting a trade,
Yeah.
but that is because the Rockets' circumstance is unique, and you just don't know yet what these teams in the top 2 are going to do. We kind of have an idea where they're leaning, although I'm not sure where Washington's leaning. They seem to be kind of hush hush about it. But we do know where Atlanta's leaning, and that does lead us to believe that possibly the players that Houston's looking at could be available at number 3. If they did trade the pick, really quick, before we get into the
Yeah.
players, what do you think they'd want?
I think if they trade the pick, I mean, ideally, I think they would want 2 future picks. However, I just don't know if that's realistic given how weak this draft is. I think the primary motivation would be to sort of add to the war chest of their stockpile for the big consolidation trade that, it still could come this summer, but more likely it'd be down the line. And so I think the primary motivation would be to get 1 future first round pick to sort of add to that asset stockpile. Ideally, I think they'd get 2 or 3, but I think the more likely scenario is that maybe you could move down to 7, 8, 9, something in that range, and then get a future first on top of that. And then if you move down, I could see, let's say the Rockets aren't sold. Either they aren't sold on Reed Sheppard having super high-end upside, or perhaps they just don't think that he would have the runway to develop that way here. if that was the case and they were looking at the pick sort of being a high floor, low ceiling guy anyway, I could see them moving down a few slots for, like a high floor role player like a Dalton Connect or a Devin Carter, someone like that, and saying, you know what, if we think we're getting a role player out of this anyway, then why don't we move down a few spots and then get a future first round pick on top of it? Not sure if that's offered, but that's the one type of scenario that I could see. It would require them being not super high on Reed themselves and also saying, hey, we think we could get a guy in sort of the same tier while also getting a future pick for the war chest down the line.
I'll say this. I tend to believe they prefer trade out versus trade down.
Well, I think so too. I just don't know how realistic that is, but yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I say that is I think the Rockets have been trying to trade out of the draft for a couple years now. I think they really wanted to trade the pick that eventually became Cam Whitmore. The problem was Cam Whitmore became available, and they're like, no, you know what? We're going to keep the pick, right? And this year, I think the plan was also to trade this pick, I believe.
Yeah, it's sort of the same thing. Jonathan Fagan wrote about that before the lottery, and it's a very similar dynamic. I love the Cam Whitmore example because in both cases, the asset value might be too high to trade out. Like if they were trading from pick 9 or pick 10, I think it'd be pretty easy to trade that pick for a future pick, and if it falls to the end of the first round, whatever, pick 9, pick 10 in this draft may not be all that valuable anyway. As opposed to now, if you trade pick 3, you just can't trade pick 3 for, say, one future first that might end up, for all we know, at 27 or 28. So it's sort of a similar dynamic to Cam a year ago in that just based on circumstances, the asset value might be too high to justify trading it for a future pick.
Yeah, have you seen that game that kids are playing on TikTok where they'll get the glass of water next to the sink and they'll just kind of like keep opening the So the Rockets roster kind of feels like that full glass of water right now.
Yeah.
And I think Houston's plan was to kind of dump a little bit out a little bit, right? Or like pour it into a different glass, right? Like they didn't want to play the game anymore, right? They just want it feels like kind of a young player overload and they're trying to find playing time for these guys, right? I think there's a real chance that Cam Whitmore would have struggled to find playing time had it not been for the injuries this year, right?
Yeah.
And injuries, and injuries worked out in his favor, and he was able to play. And this year, I just don't like. I know there are people talking about how player X may have a cleaner pathway to playing time versus player Y. I just don't think there's a clean pathway, period, for any of these guys to playing time this year, right? Whoever they draft, it's going to be very hard.
No, and I think that's what makes the trade down scenarios somewhat palatable, because I don't think there's anyone they could draft at 3 that would have a clear runway to develop. And so with that in mind, I do think there are scenarios where if theoretically you could trade down, get a player that's likely to have sort of the same development trajectory if they're just playing, 12, 15 minutes per night, maybe some DNP CDs, maybe they go to the G League for a stint like Cam did a year ago, and you get a future first, then that might be more palatable than taking a guy at number 3 who, we can say in theory this guy might have star upside, or we want him to have star upside, but there's not really a way to play him and to bring that out and to develop. That's why I think a trade is still on the table.
Yeah, I think yes, like it's easier to sell the number 6 pick being in RGV versus the number 3 overall pick, right?
Right.
For sure. But in terms of quality of player, I'm not sure how much of a difference there's going to be from 3 to 6, and that's why I'm like, I think Houston. I mean, like, listen, they're not going to complain. They're not going to be upset. They're not upset that they have this problem. This is a good problem to have.
Right.
But it is something that they're going to have to manage. I look at Oklahoma City kind of having to trade Josh Giddey, a player that they really liked internally, or more of a win-now piece for Alex Caruso. I think down the line, like next year or the year after, we may see a trade like that with one of the core 6, right? Because it's getting to a point where, like, you need to balance some of this playing time and role and development pathways. Like, there needs to be some of that happening organically. And if it's not happening organically, they may have to force the issue on the trade market.
Yeah. Well, and just financially, it's going to be very difficult to keep all 6 together. I don't care what Rafael Stone says. If they all pan out, it's going to be pretty difficult to keep these guys all into their second and third contracts. So you look at some of those guys where there's a little bit of an overlap in skill set. Certainly Jalen and Cam, to an extent, Jabari and Tari. I think if one of those guys pans out, it might make it a little more likely that the other you sort of use to trade for a piece that's more cost controlled, to use your analogy, something that it would just be very tough. Like, let's use Jalen and Cam as an example, because I think that's the most clear overlap in skill sets. If you pay Jalen Green, if he proves worthy of getting a max this coming season or something close to a max, and you invest in him at $35-40 million a year, it's tough to see 2-3 years down the line why or how you would justify paying Cam Whitmore something close to that. So there could be a world as soon as next offseason where you say, you know what, maybe it makes sense to cash out on Cam a little bit early because that role isn't going to be there. Well, the role might be there, but the financial slot is not going to be there for him long term. And conversely, if Jalen goes out and struggles this year, and Cam has a really encouraging year too, then you might say, you know what, if Jalen's market value is $30 million, maybe we want to explore signing and trading when we have a much more cost-controlled guy in Cam Whitmore who plays a very similar position internally. So these are sort of the conversations they're going to have the next couple of years regardless. And, potentially this draft slot could figure into that as well. I mean, if you take a guy like Reed Sheppard, then sure, he could fit into this same debate moving forward in terms of how likely it is you keep Jalen, how likely it is you keep Cam, and so on and so forth. That's sort of the appeal. If you keep the pick, it gives you one more hedge. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a hedge. It's important to keep that in mind because it's going to be very difficult to keep these guys all into your contract 2, contract 3, no matter what Rafael Stone says.
Yeah, bingo. Like the clock's gonna come next summer, right? When the first set of extensions start to come up, right? Like, people are gonna talk about this summer being extension possibilities for Şengün and Jalen Green. I think you and I kind of know that's not gonna happen, right? Like, the Rockets want to reserve flexibility right now, right? And they're not gonna pay anyone until they have to pay someone. And I think the trade deadline this year is really where you're going to see that first kind of point of reckoning for both those guys, but most specifically Jalen, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's going to be kind of like the first, like, okay, like either you have it or you don't, or either we want you or we don't, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting for sure. Let's get into this. So I don't know if you had a big board going into this. I had to do a crash course on this, and I had to talk to people, right? Like, I had to do more talking this time than watching because I didn't have time. I didn't know they were going to be this high, right? I was expecting 9. So that being said, I did have a rough sort of big board because I had to make one. And I was kind of like toying and like with the idea of releasing it. I never actually ended up doing it, right? Like, I was like, you know what? I'm kind of scared in putting out what I have. But then I woke up on Thursday and I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna say what I think. I'm just gonna say what I think. I'm gonna start writing an article today about who I think are the 2 greatest prospects in this draft. And the moment I start typing, I start putting pen to paper, Kelly reports that the Rockets are leaning towards the 2 guys that I had in the article, which is Reed Sheppard and Donovan Clingan. I think these are the 2 best prospects in the draft. I know there's a hesitancy to say that out loud, right? There's a lot of people that are just like, because the consensus seems to be, if there is one, Alex Sarr at number 1, and then there's Zachary Risacher possibly at number 2. I don't know what the Zachary Risacher stuff's coming from. I don't understand it still, right? Like,
I question if the athleticism is there.
Yeah. To me, it feels like a lot of wish casting in terms of like what you want this sort of player to be versus what he
archetype.
Yeah, exactly. And I just think if you don't have the archetype there, go for the best players. Go for the guys who are actually producing at a high level, at an elite projection level last year. And those 2 guys were Donovan Clingan and Reed Sheppard. They may not be stars, right? There's a possibility they aren't, but this may not be the draft for stars.
Yeah, and I also think that the board should vary from one team to the next, because I think with the Rockets in particular, if they keep this pick, the floor matters, because the way the team is constructed with the core 6, it's a little tougher for a project type to achieve his ceiling. This is not a situation like with Jalen and Jabari where a top rookie comes in and is going to play anything close to 30 minutes per game just because. So some of these younger guys that need a lot of runway to sort of iron out the kinks, if you will, guys like Alex Sarr, I don't know that they're going to find that here. The Rockets are already a 500 team. They are trying to win at a high level, and so that's where Donovan Clingan and Reed Sheppard, I agree with you, have a lot of appeal to me because there's a high floor. They can contribute to winning to some extent right away. Now, it might be a smaller role year one and year two. You might be talking 15, 20 minutes per game, but they do some things that will translate day one at the NBA level. Clingan with his rim protection, with his IQ, with his passing, Reed with his shooting. Certainly there's other aspects of the game for both of those guys that you want to develop, but they have some day one ready-made skills. And I think that's something that really matters for a team like the Rockets. So when you're coming up with your board, and I agree with you on this, it can't just be in an abstract sense. You've got to look at one team's specific situation. And so that's why I came back.
Or the player specifically, right? Like what did they actually do? Right? Like my thing is like, stop drafting for our archetype, right? Like this is my biggest frustration with draft Twitter, right? And I wrote about this in my article. They seem to, there's this, I called it in the article, I called it wing culture, right? like there's a wing culture in draft Twitter, right? Like they want wings, right? And they're going to draft for whoever they think is going to be the highest projectable wing instead of drafting the highest projectable player, right? Because the modern NBA is X, and you have to draft for X. And it's like the modern NBA is going to be different by the time these guys are in their primes. You don't know what's going to be valuable, right? And, like, if you draft for that, if you draft for X or Y, you're going to miss on players like Alperen Şengün, right?
Yeah.
When you're drafting inside the box, you miss on guys outside the box, right? It's not rocket sciences. It's not rocket science. It's just, I don't know. Yes, the team context is part of that, but also like just Zachary Risache wasn't that good. He was fine. He's fine. He's a 3-point shooter who can possibly defend, and he might be able to shoot threes. He had one good 3-point shooting season, right? Like it's kind of questionable whether or not he's an elite 3-point shooter, as some are projecting him to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say another example of this. So we haven't talked about Stephon Castle yet. I do like Castle. However, for him to take the next step, I think he needs to develop as a shooter. And how many reps can the Rockets give him in that capacity? I think, you can point to Amin Thompson, but Amin Thompson has more size. He has more athleticism. There's more positional versatility to him. And now you would be adding Castle to Amin in terms of guys with questionable shots. Now, I know Castle's form is not as broken as Amin's at the moment, but the point is neither one of them is a guy you want shooting threes at anything close to volume in the NBA. So the phrase I keep going back to, and it's one that I'm borrowing from Nathan Grubel. I had him on my podcast at Loggerline a couple of weeks ago. He's Draft Deeper on Twitter/X, is runway. You have to consider what you are willing and able to do with each player once they're on your roster. And to use Reed as an example, it can't be just about using him coming off screens and to space the floor as a shooter. For him to justify being the number 3 pick, he needs to develop in the other area of his game, as a point guard, as a defender. A lot of folks have compared Reed to Fred VanVleet, and so in that sense, Fred could be an ideal mentor for him. Okay, try and develop Reed as a facilitator, learning under, being something of an understudy to Fred. Perhaps he replaces Fred once the team gets more expensive, and we have to wait and see whether Fred gets a second deal here. So if you have a plan for that, if you are able to develop him in that way, then it makes sense. However, you look at a guy like Alex Sarr, there's a lot of potential, and a team like Washington may be able to give him reps to work on his deficiencies. The same can be said for Stephon Castle. In Houston, I don't know if a Rockets team trying to win can do that. I think they can with Reed, at least to an extent, because even if Reed takes some lumps as a defender, as a facilitator, okay, he's still going to provide positive value as a shooter. So that gives him a little bit of margin for error, if you will. With Donovan Clingan, it's a little bit tougher because, and that's why even though I like Donovan and Reed about the same, I've actually been slightly higher on Donovan through the process, I'll come around through Reed because I think if it's close, fit can be a tiebreaker, and it's a little easier to fit Reed here as opposed to Donovan, who at this point is a center only, just like Şengün. We can hope they develop a 3-point shot, that one or both can develop, the foot speed to defend on the perimeter, but right now they're 5s only, and so that might limit Donovan a little bit in terms of that runway. You also have Steven Adams on the roster, and so on and so forth. But those are the types of conversations you have to have. It's not just about how the player looks on paper and what theoretically he can be. As much as you want to say that you can put him in the G League and develop these strengths, some of these strengths are never going to be developed at a material level until the player does it in the NBA. And some of these more raw types, I'm just not sure how they're going to get the time, the reps they need in Houston on a Rockets team that's trying to win. So that's how I gravitate towards Reed and Donovan, and a little bit more towards Reed simply because Donovan is a little position limited right now. The only other scenarios I would throw out, and I teased to it earlier, but if they traded down, then yeah, a guy like Dalton Connect or someone like Devin Carter, I could see appeal to them as well for the same reasons, and that there's some ready-made skills day one, and so because of those ready-made skills, it's a little bit easier for them to work on the shortcomings at the NBA level.
Yeah, I mean, with Reed, I just think, and Donovan, like I just think those are the two best guys, like in a vacuum, right? Like regardless of team, like I'm willing to go that far with these guys. Like I just think, like I don't know why with Donovan, I don't know why he's not the consensus number one overall pick, right? Like his impact was incredible, 2-time NCAA champion, really soft touch with both hands, great defensive player, and we're drafting for guys who we think can be more malleable, I guess. That's the idea here. That's like, oh, we're gonna like, and like, why? Like what's preventing, Clingan from being a great NBA player? Not much, other than I guess team context, right?
Yeah,
And
I think wing Twitter is a good way to put it. The wing obsession,
wing culture. Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, wing culture. There you go. Because yeah, if you're drafting Rudy Gobert, I mean that is incredible value, and yet people are somehow down on Rudy Gobert just because he doesn't fit, the modern template, and we know there's, a few times in the playoffs he'll get switched on to Luka and get cooked, but come on, the impact overall, even if it's not the way most of the league is going, that's because there aren't that many players like that. If he pans out to that level, and I think a lot of evaluators think he can, why would you not be interested? Like, I was floored earlier. I was having a discussion on my timeline earlier today. I threw out a scenario of trading down with someone who's a Reed fan, and I mentioned, what if Ime Udoka, who we know is going to have a voice in these conversations, thinks that Devin Carter is the Marcus Smart for the next generation, and we know Ime values Marcus Smart. He was basically the captain of that Boston team that Ime took to the NBA Finals in Boston, and there's been some talk that the Rockets might even consider a Smart +9 proposal to trade down. If they're that high on Devin Carter that they think he has like defensive player of the year upside, I don't care that he's not a wing. I don't care that he's not a shot creator, so to speak. That is still an immensely impactful player. Now, that's a very different type of defender than Clingan, who's a rim protector, who's a big, but I think we're getting to the same dynamic, which is that there's such an obsession on wings, these 6'8", 6'9" athletes that can defend 1 through 5, and yeah, that's great, but there's still a role for defense at a high level at the point of attack with smaller guys and with your rim protectors, your true drop guys like Donovan Clingan, like Rudy Gobert. And if you can be like a best defensive player in the league type of player, then even if that doesn't fit in the modern, wing culture, if you will, there's still a lot of value when it comes to winning games from that type of player.
Yeah, I mean, like, look at the last 5 NBA champions. The Lakers, the Warriors, the Nuggets, the Celtics. Like, I mean, maybe I'm forgetting another team, but one of those teams was built around wings, right? Like the other ones kind of found utility wings to make it up, right?
Yeah.
Like,
there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah, yep. And like the NBA is not homogenous, as you said. Like, there's lots of ways to skin a cat, and like I think part of this stems from like 10 years ago when Daryl Morey was really kind of ahead of the curve here. It's saying like these kind of 3-and-D wings are undervalued, right? Like 3-and-D.
Yeah.
Like that was true 10 to 15 years ago when Morey was saying that. I think if you asked Morey now, he'd probably have a different answer, right? We've caught up, right? Like they're sufficiently valued, and I think in some cases overvalued, right? In like the Mavericks trading Kristaps Porzingis for like Tim Hardaway Jr. and I'm forgetting the second player, right? Like that kind of a trade represents kind of like going too far with it, right?
Well, and I also think wings theoretically give you more protection against a bust scenario because these super long wings, there's multiple roles that they can be used in. So I think because there's more utility and they can fit in more roster constructs, then a lot of GMs and in turn a lot of fans think those players are safer. The thing about the Rockets is and fans should not forget this, the Rockets have a strong hand as is. The Rockets already have a deep young core. They are 500 as is. They are getting better just through internal development, organic learning, whatever you want to call it. So the Rockets can gamble on best player available. The Rockets don't have to think, and I think that's where a lot of these, wing or project players, these archetypes are so appealing. It's because, well, if they develop one way, then they can fit this role. If they develop in a different way, then they can be used in this capacity, as opposed to, a Reed Sheppard or Donovan Clingan. There's sort of one way that you can use those guys, and we generally know what that is. And so it just depends on, are they good or not? Are they good enough or not? But the Rockets can take that gamble, and that's what shouldn't be forgotten. The Rockets are not the Washington Wizards. The Rockets are not needing to necessarily take the biggest theoretical swing just because it gives, or one that gives them more outs. Because I don't even know it's necessarily the biggest swing. To your point, if Clingan's the best player, then that's the biggest swing. It's more just a guy like Sar and to a lesser extent Ricochet. I think a lot of fans view them as having, more potential outcomes. As opposed to the Rockets can just say, look, even if the role is more defined, we have enough as is. We can just go for who we think is the best player. And at the end of the day, we can sort the rest out later.
Yeah, and like having more potential outcomes doesn't necessarily mean they're likely to reach those potential outcomes.
That too,
right? Like,
yeah.
Like that's always my argument with this stuff. It's like, yeah, is Alex Sar, does he have more pathways in the NBA than your typical rookie? Sure, but does that mean he's going to reach the highest end? Like no, probably not.
No.
Like, I mean, there's more going against him than for him in that respect, right? The only thing going for him is that his archetype as a player. I don't know. I just think, like, and you're right. The Rockets already have a dearth of wings, right? They have
Right.
like almost every player on the roster except for Şengün. Every young player on the roster is a wing, right? So I just think it's just a narrow framework of thinking about the NBA and thinking about the draft in general. I think that's probably the biggest advantage one may have in evaluating the draft. If you didn't view it in that narrow construct, you'd have a huge advantage in evaluating these guys.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, although I will, to your point, I agree that Reed and Donovan are my two favorite players in the draft. However, I do think at this point in terms of the likely outcome, and I say this as someone that was pushing Clingan early on, at this point, the way I would rank what I think is actually likely to happen, I think most likely scenario, they stay put and draft Reed. Second most likely scenario, they trade back or out. And then the third most likely scenario is they stay at 3 and draft someone that is not Reed, such as Donovan Clingan or Stefan Castle or Alex Sar.
What I'm worried about is Matas Buzelis.
I don't think that's happening.
Because you heard a lot of his name early in the process, right? Coming out of the Rockets camp, and it's like I get.
I'd be surprised. I just don't see the runway for a project like that.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the whole wing stuff. You're drafting in theory versus practice, right? He is a talented prospect, but there's so many question marks with him. But yeah, I mean, we can talk about this. So you think it's Reed? You think Reed's gonna be the pick?
I think that's the most likely. I mean, I don't have anywhere near the conviction that I did the last few years, but that's precisely why. The last 3 years, so we knew in 2021 that their preference was Jalen. We knew in 2022 their preference was Paolo. We knew in 2023 their preference was Amen. We don't know in 2024. It has been decidedly more quiet. I'm not just saying that perusing through Twitter. I can say that through my own conversations. They have been far less forthcoming this year. And I don't think that's necessarily a change in strategy. I know some people have said, well, are the Rockets too leaky in the past? No, I think they leak for a reason. I think that, and it's not always to media, it may be to agents, and then the agents tell the media, but I think it's, they want to be transparent. There's a lot of value in the modern NBA with media, with fans, more importantly, with agents and other teams, to being viewed as trustworthy, to being seen as transparent. Because a lot of the NBA these days is about perception. It's about narratives. You want to be a player-friendly organization. And so I think when the Rockets view it as highly likely that a certain scenario is going to play out, then they see it as an opportunity to, build some trust equity. And even if they don't tell the media themselves, if they tell, a couple of agents, hey, this is what we're likely to do, then that's going to get to the media, and that's why the last couple of years we've had a good idea at this stage in the game what they're going to do. That has not happened this year. And I don't think it's because the Rockets did a 180 and said, well, we're just not going to leak anything this year. No, I think it's because legitimately they are more conflicted this year. There's not as clear cut of an option as opposed to last year. I think they really wanted him in. However, the reason that has me thinking Reed, and I've said this throughout the process, is that you have to keep an open mind. There's no one in the core six that's so established that you say, this guy is for sure going to be here 10 years, and so because of that, I'm not going to consider a player of this archetype at this position. Not even Alperen Şengün. If you come to the end of the process and you think Donovan Clingan is best player available, you take Donovan Clingan, worry about the rest later. I've said that. However, because I think they're near the end of the process and there isn't clearly a best player available, I think that's why that we haven't heard a leak. The Rockets don't know at this point. I think they're still sort of debating it internally. Then I do think if it's that close, which it hasn't been the last few years, then fit can be something of a tiebreaker. Fit, runway, the things we've been describing this whole podcast. And I think when you look at it in that lens, there's easier ways for Reed to make an impact. There's more ways to develop him. And so because of that, if it's close, then I think they lean Reed simply because the infrastructure is there to develop him in a way that I don't think it's quite to that level with the other prospects.
Yeah, I think. I mean, the eco report was kind of leaky, right? That was kind of a tip of the hand if that ends up being if they do end up drafting one of these two. But I think really when you look at what the Rockets are in terms of organizational goals, I just think a lot of it is they didn't expect to be this high.
That too,
right? I just think they really.
Their process started later, at least for the top.
Their process started later. And also, I think they may have, because this draft is so up in the air, it does benefit one, if you do think someone is clearly ahead of the curve, right? And you don't know if, pick one or two is going to go in that direction. It's you're not number one, so there's no benefit to leaking, right? So, you might as well keep that to yourself. And if that player falls to you, okay, yeah, now we can have the best player in the draft. Or the second best player in the draft, et cetera, et cetera.
Although I will say, to your point on Kelly's reporting, I don't know if you noticed, but the mock that came out from Jonathan Fagan Sunday actually has Reed. So even within the two Houston beat reporters, you have Kelly saying that Clingan's at the top of their list, although he said Reed is closely behind, and you have Jonathan, who in his final mock is projecting Reed. So I would just say that, sure, there's been a little bit of talking. It's not like they're...
Who did Jonathan have at 1 or 2?
I think he had Ricochet at 1 and Sarr at 2.
Okay.
It might have been the reverse order, but it was the two French guys at 1 and 2. And he had Clingan falling all the way to 7. But the point is, it's not that there are no conversations. Let's not be silly. I mean, Rafael Stone, they're still returning texts. They're still making occasional phone calls. But even to the beat guys here in town, I don't think they're anywhere near as open as they've been the last couple of years. I don't think it's necessarily a change in strategy. I think it's that genuinely there's still some indecision. I highly doubt even at Toyota Center right now that they 100% know what they're going to do. Now, part of that may be because there's, it's not for sure what Atlanta and Washington are going to do in front of them. But there's more uncertainty this year, and I think that's sort of driving, I guess, the lack of clarity that we have right now compared to the stage the last few years.
I think they're going to take Reed.
Same.
Gun to the head, I think they're going to take Reed.
Same,
I think,
that's what I would say.
And the reason, I talked to as many people as I could because, again, the lack of knowledge I had on this draft going in was just tremendous compared to the last few years because I didn't think they were going to draft this high. So I talked to a lot of analytics people, and the two names that consistently came up at the top of the models was Sheppard and Clingan. Both of those two guys, no matter which model you looked at, they just consistently the top. And we know the Rockets are an analytically focused organization. We know Tari Eason was a result of that. We know that, who'd they take at 20?
Cam Whitmore.
Cam Whitmore was another analytically friendly player. We know that the Rockets still use a lot of this in their core decision making. And I just tend to believe, if there's some indecision, they might just kind of lean on their numbers, and the numbers across the board just say Reed's better.
Yeah, And we should note that even if it's a relatively small sample, which it is, 1 year off the bench at Kentucky, at the same time, shooting 52% on threes for a guy who is already taking a substantial amount from NBA range and beyond. This is not a case where it's a small sample and a guy just got hot at the 20.5-foot college three-point line. No, he's already operating well beyond it, so that shooting should translate. Even in a small sample, there's enough there to be confident in it. You threw out, I think, 65% for one of your numbers earlier. What I would say, and this is just a general ballpark, I'm at 50% they stay at 3 and draft Reed. 30% they trade down or out. 20% they stay at 3 and draft someone that isn't Reed.
Yeah.
That's sort of my lay of the land right now.
Yeah, I was like 65% they stay at 3. I don't know about
I'd say 70% stay at 3.
We're the same
and
thing.
Then,
Yeah. We're basically in agreement here. Like I think it's the smart move. I mean, I think he fits their roster, and like in that, like there is a cleaner. There's no clean pathway to playing time. There is a cleaner pathway for him than the other guys. And I just think he's good. Like he's a tremendous 3-point shooter, tremendous mid-range shooter, good in a diverse way. Like he's not just hitting catch and shoots. He's hitting pull-ups at a high clip. I think the what may give you pause is like his handle is still not quite like
right.
Like he if he wants to get to the pull-up, he needs to get more crafty with it, right? He needs to really work on that handle. And if he's got to play point guard in the NBA, he obviously needs to work on that handle. Well, what also may give you pause is he's 6'3" with a 6'4" wingspan, basically. That's a little small for a point guard. I mean, not for a point guard, for a shooting guard in the NBA. So he pretty much, like, I don't say he has to play point guard, but like the easiest pathways to development involve him playing point guard. So he needs to be, the handle needs to be great. It needs to get better. The defensive, what he showed defensively was optimistic, but he's still, that first step when he's guarding guys off the dribble, it's not always there. He's catching up a lot of the times, which is fine, but like obviously that's some athleticism work he can work on.
Yeah,
I think one thing that he does not get enough credit for, he's actually more athletic than you might think. He got a ton.
Yeah, he is.
He got a ton of blocks on, like
42-inch vertical, man.
Yeah, I mean, like the amount of 3-pointers he blocked, like where he was just like way far away, he just closing in and blocking threes.
Yeah.
I mean, and the hand-eye coordination obviously is elite. I mean, that's with all shooters, but like he's getting a bunch of steals too, right? Like, and that's hand-eye coordination.
Yeah, I would say the one question, to go back to the word runway that I've thrown out a few times on this pod, it is fair to question just how many on-ball reps he can get with Fred as your starter at point guard. Ideally, you want Amen to be more of an on-ball guy than he was last year when he predominantly worked off-ball, especially late in the season. We know that Jalen and Şengün have a lot of things run through them as well. So I understand at a surface level this idea that, well, are there going to be enough on-ball opportunities for him to develop in those other areas to be worth the investment? But what I would say to that is if all these other things pan out, that's a good problem to have. If Fred ages well, stays healthy, is open to staying long-term, and will take a, let's say hypothetically Fred takes a team-friendly deal to, at a lower cap figure to extend after this current, and he still plays well into his 30s. If Amen Thompson develops as the point guard you wanted him to be a year ago, if Jalen picks up where he did in March, I mean, these are good problems to have. If you have too many good on-ball guys, that's sort of an embarrassment of riches, and whatever, you can make moves later. I mean, that's where I keep coming back to. I mean, the runway thing, it's fair to keep that in mind, but I just think with Reed specifically, when you look at how it would play out, if there's too many guys internally, then you're in a great spot anyway. So I don't think that's a situation where you'd say, man, I wish I had taken someone other than Reed Sheppard, because worst case, he has value as a shooter. You could trade him later on. I've said that with Clingan too. Like, worst case, if some of these guys don't have the role exactly as you would optimize it here in Houston, if they just show skills in some areas, then they should be very projectable. Clingan as a rim protector, Reed as a shooter, to where worst case you could trade him later on in a year or two and provide a fit that's a little bit better for you here in Houston. So for me, it's just when you actually look at what the negatives are, I really don't think they're that severe in Reed's case, and so that's why I think the odds-on scenario is that they just keep the pick and take him.
Yeah, I am very curious to see how he's going to do against like real like NBA size. At Summer League is probably going to be the first big test. Like I want to see how he does against those guys. He should do well. I mean, it's not like he was like struggling by any extent, like at the college level when bigger guys defended him. But it was one of those things where like that was always a question because you're playing against college guys. Like, how are you going to do against like 6'5", 6'6" wings, that are guarding you with like 6'7" wingspans? Like, can he still get that shot off? Is he going to have to do more work off the ball, running off of screens, pin downs, all that stuff to get open? That's going to be interesting. He does get high up off the ground when he's shooting, which is a good thing, and that's going to help him get some separation. And the fact that he's so high, he's not going to get blocked as often.
Yeah, this is more for a pod a couple of weeks from now, assuming they actually keep the pick. But if they do keep the pick, draft Reed, then yeah, I would hope they use him more on ball in Summer League just to see how he fares. Because I think off ball, look, Summer League defenses are not very connected because so many of these guys have just played together in minicamp for like a week before going to Vegas. So there's nowhere near the communication that there is in a real NBA game. So because of that, I mean, if you use Reed off the ball, then yeah, he's going to find ways to get open, and he's going to, bury teams with threes, and it's not even really a challenge when you consider how elite of a shooter we already know he is. I think Ryan Russillo pointed out that he's one of the best shooting prospects that he's seen. I think where Summer League could be useful, because there are a lot of great athletes, yeah, if you draft him, and this is, again, for a pod a week or two from now, but if you draft him, yeah, put him on the ball, see how he handles the elite athleticism. Can he create? Can he create a little bit of space? Can he facilitate for his teammates? All those are questions that I think would be, while not answered, it would be much more useful to see how he handles it at Summer League as opposed to using him off ball, because off ball, I mean, if you can shoot it all in Summer League, there's going to be a role for you just because the defenses are not that connected.
Yeah, it should be fun. I can't wait till draft night. I kind of suspect it might go chalk, but that's fine. Like the Rockets are going to get a really awesome prospect. Maybe it's not the strongest class, but you're talking probably the 6th or 7th overall pick in any other class, which is great.
Yeah.
All right, Ben, can you tell the people where we can find you on X and read your work for USA Today Sports Media Group?
Yep. Ben DuBose on X, the Rockets Wire, and the Logger Line on X, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all the daily coverage. And the one thing I'll say, I know this is all a draft pod, but the last thing I'll leave people with. So you mentioned draft probably being the one exciting day for the Rockets this offseason. I think you're probably right. However, every day that passes without news pertaining to an extension for Donovan Mitchell or a new contract for Paul George, I get a little more suspicious. I don't think the Rockets would make a move for a below all-star tier. We've covered that in the past. Brandon Ingram, even Mikal Bridges, I don't think those move the needle as much. I think the Rockets would stand pat for one of the really big names. And again, it takes two to tango. Just because the Rockets are interested, even if they want to leave, well, there's other teams would be interested too. So it's inherently unlikely. But every day there's not an extension between Mitchell and the Cavaliers, not a new deal between George and the Clippers, I get a little more curious. So as we get closer to the draft, again, teams want clarity on whether their guys are bought in, because obviously whether Mitchell is bought in can influence what Cleveland does in the draft, what they do in free agency, so on and so forth. Every day that passes without word of an extension or a new contract, I get a little bit more curious. I still think it's very unlikely. I'm not super excited about it just yet, but the deeper we go into this week and the closer we get to Sunday's, June 30th opening of free agency negotiations, the more my eyes are going to open a little bit more to that. So I would just say, while I'm not predicting it by any means, it's something to sort of keep your eyes peeled for.
Yeah, and that's why I put the bearing some sort of unforeseen trade caveat in there. It's because like Mitchell is the one guy where it's like he's worth it. Like he's like a all NBA caliber player, and like he's someone you'd want to put real chips on the table for, right? Maybe not all of them, but like a significant amount of them for consolidation purposes, and it ends up being worth it most of the time. So, like it is definitely something to watch for. In the meantime, listen, like I'm okay with this being a laid back summer. Like the Rockets are in a good spot.
Yeah, I don't think they need to by any means.
Yeah. Like the Rockets are in a great spot. It would be nice to just kind of watch them develop a little bit more next season. Then maybe we get fireworks next summer. Who knows? We'll see how the season ends out. Or
trade deadline.
Yeah, the trade deadline too. In the meantime, thanks for coming on, Ben. It was a pleasure having you.
Yep.
If you guys enjoyed the show, again, YouTube, subscribe, thumbs up, iTunes, Spotify, 5 stars. Yeah, guys, we'll talk to you later.